Good, let me see, afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday. Happy Friday. Just want to welcome you guys to part 3 of Dr. Matthews' webinar series under Don Sapro's Standing Watch. Oh, you know what? Let me share the screen so you guys know where you're at today. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Let me get the slides up. Sorry about that. Yeah, welcome. Just waiting for a few minutes for everybody to come in. We like to come in and give you guys a chance for participants to come in. We'll start the webinar in a couple of minutes. Let me see. Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Just want to tell you guys a little bit about the logistics for today. If we have a question and answer function that you guys are able to submit your questions to Dr. Matthews. He'll be answering questions throughout his talk live, as well as typing them if he has chances to. So welcome to the webinar series. You guys are welcome to talk in the chat, ask your questions in the question and answer function, and we will get to them. We thank you guys for joining us on this fantastic Friday. Last week was a little bit off energy, but this week I'm feeling great. I'm ready to go into the weekend, feeling high spirited. It's good weather outside, so I'm excited to have you guys here. I work for NavalX. We are the Navy Super Connector. We partner with organizations like Don Sapro to give them the platform they need to get information, wonderful information out to the different naval communities. And so what we were able to accomplish, Don Sapro has this fantastic webinar that, I did not have the slides on repeat. You know what? I had a worse Friday last week, but all the technology was great. And this week I'm feeling great and I can't get my mind around the technology. But what I've liked to do in COVID times, I just roll with the punches. I just, just call it for what it is. So let me see, I'm gonna run these slides one more time. Sorry about that. Let me see. We'll get started for the webinar in a couple of minutes. Yes, welcome. We will get started in a minute. Wanted to welcome everybody on this fantastic Friday. We have a chat function, so we have Julie and Jessica that will be reaching out in the chat to start conversations. You're welcome to have discussions with each other about Dr. Matthews' presentation today. If you have question and answers, I would ask you guys to direct them to the question and answer function, and that way Dr. Matthews will be able to read the questions and answer them live for you guys. We have another part 3 to his wonderful webinar series, and if you missed the first 2, please reach out to Don Sapro's staff. Julie and Jessica will put their contact information. We have the videos up on YouTube from session 1 and session 2, and they're also offering certificates of completion. So after confirming participation in these webinars, offering certificates of completion so that you guys are able to get your CEUs, but also just the wonderful information. It's not always about just checking off a box. I know that's what drives a lot of us, but this has been some fantastic information, Dr. Matthews. We've been having wonderful conversations, and we just thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining Don Sapro. Thank you, Don Sapro, for partnering here with NavalX. And Jessica, I'm going to give it away to you to welcome everybody. And again, hope you guys have a fantastic Friday.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I know we've got folks from all over the world on the line, and we appreciate you tuning in. For those of you who are with us for the first time, just to give you a little bit of background on the series, we started the Standing Watch webinar series when we recognized some of the unique stressors our first responders were facing during COVID-19. And so our goal was to provide our first responder workforce with resources for maintaining resilience and self-care so that they can continue to provide optimal care to those who need it. And one of the things we've been really excited about is that there's been an incredible interest beyond the first responder community and the recognition that these skills are really critical across a variety of leadership positions. So Thanks again, everyone, for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, or for those of you who have tuned in previously. We're excited that Dr. Matthews is here again for the part 3 of 4 of this Resilience series. Dr. Matthews is a psychology professor at the U.S. Military Academy. He's written extensively on performance, character, a number of aspects around military psychology with an extensive focus on resilience. And I know he and retired Lieutenant General Caslin have been writing extensively on character and leadership. So we're looking forward to their book coming out in a few months. And for those of you who missed the previous sessions, one of the benefits of Dr. Matthews' background is that he's not only a researcher and a leader in this field, but he has extensive uniform and first responder experience to support the research he puts out. One of the things we'll be doing today, we will allow for questions and engagement with Dr. Matthews. We just ask that for anyone who has questions, if you could put those in the question and answer box, and we'll then select folks to respond. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mike Matthews. Thanks so much, Mike.
Oh, thanks for the introduction, Jess, and hello, those of you who attended the first 2 sessions, and greetings as well to the ones who are new to the sessions. Jess, just a couple of administrative things. One is everybody. There's some natural stopping points along this presentation day. So we're going to begin, for example, by talking about grit and resilience. And when we finish that little section, I'm going to pause and maybe Jess, you can help me kind of keep an eye out for questions, and we can pause and take a few questions at that point. And similarly, there are some other sort of natural stopping points along the way where we can kind of gather together and ask questions while they're fresh in your mind, specific to various aspects of resilience. And the other administrative thing is, Jess and Julie, I sent you about a 3-page document with resources. And I want everybody to know that that's available. And I presume that you hung that somewhere where they can find it. But the resources kind of summarize some additional readings if you're interested, some background stuff, some book recommendations, a few videos you can look at if you have time, just as you might wish. So that said, let's go ahead and dig into really continuation of this whole notion of how you can build a resilience toolkit and use your character strengths and these other things we'll talk about today to help you deal with the hard times and adversity that's inevitable in life, and seems especially so right now with the pandemic and other issues. So next slide, please. This is just by way of summary. In session 1, the chief objective was to talk about really 4 trajectories that tend to follow adversity and hard times and trauma. And we spent quite a bit of time, most of that session, sort of unpacking each of those 4 trajectories. And it's, obviously it can be a little more complicated than that. I'd like to, to say that, for example, that if you take the resilience trajectory, which we aim for, at least, if you're a very, very highly resilient person to start with, or should say very high in terms of your emotional fitness, your emotional adjustment, then when you encounter the adversity at that point, it drops a bit. It may not even drop enough to drop you down in sort of a danger zone or red zone for, things like depression or PTSD. It can make you feel a little worse, but may not be that impactful. And then you return back to baseline, which defines resilience, and you're back to where you were. But if you happen to be sort of functioning at a lower level of emotional fitness or emotional resilience, and that's sort of your standard baseline, well, then the events that we're experiencing today are much more damaging in some ways. And so this is a little bit of simplification, these 4 trajectories, but I believe they're a useful way to help us sort of conceive of how different people respond to these types of events. That was session 1. Let's go to the next. Next slide. There we go. So session 2, I sort of characterized by this particular slide, character in the good life. And again, I believe these slides are all available to you through your organizers. I really like this depiction because if you look in the center, the goal for us all is a life of pleasure. Why not? Pleasure is good. Engagement in what we do, and more than anything else, meaning and purpose. And the theme of the second session, last Friday, was that part of the way to get to that center circle is to learn about your various character strengths and learn to employ those as a tool to help you both achieve goals that you may be of value to you, but also to enhance social relationships and to bolster your sense of well-being overall. So if you missed session 2, that's session 2, like in a nutshell. And let's go to the next slide. During session 2, and I'm going to thank Julie for this, one of the questions I posed was, look, you don't need to go back a slide, but if you just remember the slide I just showed you, I asked participants to type in 1 or 2 character strengths that they thought were most important for SARCs to possess to do a good job and to be resilient in the face of the challenges that SARCs experience in their profession. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this is called a word cloud. And so you see the big word kind, K-I-N-D, written in the biggest letters. That means kind was the word that was most often, the attribute that was most often mentioned. And love was a big one, and hope and empathy. So the stuff in really tiny print, the smaller print, are mentioned, but not nearly as often. And it's just kind of a fun and interesting way to capture expert opinion. You guys are the experts. So I appreciate, first of all, you offering your words so we could build this word cloud. And I thank Julie for being resourceful on the fly, I think, to do this as we went along. So 5 minutes after the session last week, she sent me this. I thought, wow, this is so good. I just wanted to share it with you. And I hope it captures the types of character strengths that really matter to you in your jobs. Next, please. So here we go. Let's take a minute to look at this cartoon, really. I sort of label it the iceberg model of resilience. And there you see 3 winners, a first place, gold, silver, and bronze medalist, I guess. And it could be anything. It could be an athletic event, or maybe these are people who excelled in academics or just really good at being parents or family members. They're doing really great. And there's the crowd looking at them. There's photographers taking pictures and cheering. And heck, when I see people do well, I think, man, I'd like to be able to do that. They must be really special. They must be really, really smart to do that, or they must have attributes maybe I don't have so much. But really, it's important to contrast what we see with what we don't see. And here's the what makes this the iceberg model. If you just look down below, hopefully you can read this on your screens. I'll read a few of these just to illustrate. So you look at these other boxes that aren't seen in the people that are standing on the stage. I see things like courage and patience and desire and training and effort, pain even, focus, honesty. So you have a whole bunch of things that probably fit into the character strengths that we mentioned last week. But other additional factors, and I'm going to say sleep and nutrition and exercise and vision, and in fact, like sadness and pain and injury. Sometimes you must go through those things in order to stand up there on the podium. And it's important to think about, for each of us to pause and reflect, that when we achieve something great, we're aware of all the effort and the background that went into it. But when you see others do well, sometimes it's easy to kind of forget about all that stuff below the waterline of the iceberg. And I'd say, you could also extrapolate this a little bit to people. Maybe they're not on a podium. Maybe they're suffering. What you see is suffering, and you think maybe, you make some attributions to why they're suffering, but what you can't see are all the things that are underneath that iceberg that are, below the waterline in the iceberg, which are contributing to the pain and frustrations and sometimes failures and lack of resilience and vulnerability they're showing. So when you think about human behavior, whether it's success or failure, it's very important, again, to keep in mind. So that there's a lot more than meets the eye. So the purpose of today's discussion is to talk about just a few more factors that are involved in resilience. If we go to the next slide, the first of these I want to talk about is something you probably heard about. It's called grit. So the picture there, you may wonder, if you're stationed in England or been to England, other places in Europe or the British Isles, when you're driving around, you'll see, especially in the country roads, at hilly intersections, this box full of of grits, literally grits, like sand. And when it gets slick in the winter, up in Yorkshire, for example, or the Lake District, people come and they shovel the grit off onto the drive or the tarmac, so that it provides traction and allows cars to go up and down the hill. So really, grit is kind of like, in some ways, the psychological concept of grit is that substance which helps us get past the slick spots in life and to achieve and reach our objectives. So let's talk about grit, a little bit of the science of it, and some of the some of the major findings that I think are relevant to this discussion. And I won't get too technical about it. I could, because it turns out that I'm one of the original scientists who worked on the GRIT project with Dr. Duckworth from University of Pennsylvania. It was her idea, but I helped her develop it here in the military context at West Point and then elsewhere. So we've been, Angela and I, working together now for, you do the math, I had 17 years now, or 16 years on GRIT research. Next, please. So we define GRIT as the passionate pursuit of long-term goals. The best way to really learn more in depth about GRIT is to read Angela Duckworth's book. So just, I gave the link to Amazon here on the screen, but just put in Angela Duckworth GRIT into Amazon or any of your favorite booksellers, and they'll pop right up. And it's worth a read. It's sold over 1 million copies in the United States. It's very readable. I think it has a lot of sage advice and information about GRIT that you'll be able to use in your own lives and in your work. Just wanted to give that background. But GRIT is that passionate pursuit of a long-term goal. So what's not GRIT? So you can make a distinction between GRIT and something like self-regulation. And so self-regulation is something that you can control what you do, but it's over the short term. So self-regulation, the humorous example might be, you're at a meeting at work and somebody's brought in donuts and they hand a plate of donuts in front of you and you're able to say no, because they got 8,000 calories or whatever it is and fat in them, and you're able to say no. And you can do that over a period of time. It's over a matter of minutes or hours. Is self-regulation. GRIT, in contrast, GRIT plays out over days, weeks, some months, sometimes even years. So, some of you may be pursuing an undergraduate degree or another degree while working full-time. You don't do that in a week. You don't do that in a month. You don't do that in a year usually. It takes a long time. And to do so, despite everything else you're doing, and to satisfy that goal would be an example or a manifestation of GRIT, a very, very useful one that you may be familiar with. Next, please. So if you haven't done so already, I'm just going to pause for a second. If you've got your computers up, you can just go to Google and literally type in, take the GRIT test. Okay? Or you can try to copy the address up here on the screen. If you just take the GRIT test, put that into Google, and just go back and stay there for a second. And it's 10 questions. And I'm gonna pause, and Jess, if you see any questions that people have that you think I could entertain a question to just right now while people take that test. Some of you may have already taken it. That's okay. We're gonna going to give everybody else about a minute and a half here to take it.
Thanks so much, Mike. I don't see anything coming through yet. I've encouraged folks to, oh, wait a minute. It looks like we may
There's
have
one.
one question. And I don't know if you can see this, Mike, in terms of going back to the first few slides with the
Yeah.
first, second, and third place participants. Is it wrong to think that those medals have no meaning if the things people don't see don't exist?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Wrong to think.
That's meaning, of course, the people that have done things. Let me read the
Oh,
question.
Dr. Matthews, I think I understand the question.
Yeah.
The question is pretty much saying, say someone went through 10 stages of adversity to win second place, but the person who won first place only went through 3 stages of adversity. Does that mean that first place is not as valuable as the second place because they didn't go through as much to get to that top part? The top
Oh, I
position?
I understand that. I think that's very subjective, based kind of on the individual, because it is true. If you look at Olympic athletes and you look at interviews of those who won gold versus those who took silver or bronze, depending on their expectation, you'll watch in the Olympics. Some people take bronze and they do the big Snoopy dance. I mean, it's like the happiest thing that ever happened to them. They're extremely proud. There's others who take silver and act like their best friend died. So how you evaluate an accomplishment depends a lot on your expectations and certainly the amount of effort that went into it. So I would suspect for things like that, the Olympian level, I mean, if I'd like to be able to give the grit test to all Olympians and see what their average was, I bet it'd be really high. But I think that's a fair thing to say that if it just came naturally easy to you and you won, maybe it wouldn't be as quite as satisfying. I think that's possible. Thanks, Ashley, for interpreting for me, and sorry, Beaumont, for not quite capturing it right off. So I think about folks may have had a chance now to take the test. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, and I saw a comment about grade satisfaction. That's true as well. So just if you want to know kind of how you did, you won't have a decimal place beyond other than just the 10th. So based on various studies, the average grit score for adults who are 25 or older is about 3.53. That's on a 5-point scale. Ivy League undergraduates, these are actually University of Pennsylvania first-year students, FROSH, who were enrolled in an intro to psychology class, and their average was 3.46, not too much different. And I'm going to offer an explanation for that. You might think that young folks who are worked hard enough and such to get into an Ivy League school might be grittier, but let me see if I can address that in a moment. West Point cadets, the average is about 3.78. I've got 11 years of data on that and about 12,000 data points. So that's a pretty stable estimate. Angela also gave the grit test to these kids that take the National Spelling Bee. And so you've seen this on TV from time to time, probably, these gutsy little kids who can stand up and spell words I've never even heard of and get them right. Their average is 3.50. And parenthetically, just tell an anecdote about one of the finalists. This is the year, it's been a number of years ago now, and you may or may not remember. But there's this one finalist, he stood up, to get his word, and whoever the MC was gave him the word, and the kid got so freaked out, he actually literally passed out, and he fainted. He just fell down on the stage. So people came running out and sort of raised him up. He goes, "What was that word?" And he told him, and he spelled it. He spelled it correctly. As an anecdotal example, but that's grit. And there's one for you Marines out there listening. These were U.S. Marine recruits, enlisted recruits, and they have an average of 3.71, and that does nothing but reinforce my stereotype of Marines as being real hardworking, types of people. So you just kind of see where you land in there, and you have some comparison points. Let's go to the next one, please. Next slide. Angela and I and some others just recently published another article that looked at 11,000 cadets over a decade. And what we want to know is we compared, because an interesting question is, if you're trying to achieve things that are difficult and to be resilient in the face of adversity, how important is grit, let's say, this character strength of grit, compared to, and that question that was asked earlier kind of gets at this, to the talent, sort of your innate or acquired talent. And in the West Point case, which where we tested this, also physical ability. So we had good measures on all cadets over this 10-year period. So we knew what their grit score was. And let me hasten to point out that we assessed grit on the day after they arrived at West Point, or the 2 days after they arrived, before they got socialized into the military or into the institution. So I think this was a pretty good point estimate of what their true grit value was coming out of high school or coming out of where they come just previously to coming to West Point. We also knew what their talent was as defined by cognitive ability, which are SAT scores and ACT scores. So we had grit and we had, let's just call it cognitive ability rather than talent. And then we also had them take a physical ability test that every cadet candidate who wants to come to West Point has to complete something called the Cadet Physical Assessment, the Cadet Fitness Assessment, Cadet Fitness Assessment, or CFA. And so we knew that. We wanted to compare, like, how important was how smart you are, as evidenced by ACT scores, with this quality of grit, with physical ability in doing well in the military training and combined academic environment. So we wanted to look, how did these play out in quitting early? And by that we meant, did they drop out the first summer before even the first semester started? So cadet basic training runs the first 6 weeks after they arrive. We want to know who made it through there and who didn't. And then of course, did grit, talent, or physical ability, which one mattered the most? We also want to know how these factors affected doing well across the whole 4 years at West Point. And there's 3 things that we looked at. It was it was academic grade point average, and it was physical fitness grade point average, and then also military performance average, sort of their sort of military skills. And then finally, we wanted to see how these affected graduation. Did you graduate or not? Did you finish what you started? If you go to the next slide. Let's go back. I'm sorry. I actually hid some slides here because I didn't want to get too nerdy on you. But what we found was, and those of you who are in the military or have been, I want you to think about this and see if you agree. We looked at, think about basic training. It's cadet basic training, but it's basic training. I went through it in the Air Force. Everybody's been in the Navy, has been through basic training. We've all been through it if you've worn the uniform. And in my experience, and subjectively, getting through my basic training in the Air Force wasn't too much about how smart I was. It was all about my ability to tolerate frustration and to work through all the engineered obstacles that the trainers put in front of us and just not to quit. So it turns out with our cadets that the only thing that predicted getting through cadet basic training was grit. Grit. So, you know, having been served in the military, I don't find that especially surprising. Those maybe who've not had that experience you might think, well, maybe having really high SAT scores helps. But you're sitting out at 4:30 in the morning, and it's raining and it's 48 degrees up here in the Hudson Highlands, and you're shivering because you're cold. That's not an intellectual exercise. That's just saying, by God, I'm going to get through this next day and get through training. Now, when we got to predicting how well they did academically over 47 months, well, not surprisingly, academic talent as measured by standardized test scores, let's just say the SAT, for instance, that was the most important thing. Okay, so many of you have been to college. If you're in college now, you've got kids in college. The SAT and the ACT scores are probably the best predictor, certainly not the only thing, but the best predictor of how well kids are going to do in college. And finally, we're interested in what, I'm sorry, let me back up. In terms of military performance, though, and physical fitness performance, grit and cadet fitness assessments were the most important things. The SATs didn't matter so much. The only things the SAT really mattered for was the academic grades. And that's what they're designed to do. And then finishing what you start. Grit was the most important thing. And second was physical ability and actually graduating 47 months after they arrived. SAT contributed a bit, but it wasn't overwhelmingly important. So I just want you to kind of relate that as to your own lives, hard things you've done. Maybe you're not in the military, but you've done hard things, I'm quite sure. And grit, therefore, it seems to be especially important in things that just require gritting your teeth and gutting it through. Those types of things are most influenced by grit. Let's go to the next, now we can go to the next slide. So here's some other things we've found. As an older person, I like this. Age clearly increases with age. If you just imagine a stair-step function beginning with under 18, 18 to 24, in 6-year increments all the way up to Methuselahs of the world, such as myself, grit just keeps going higher and higher. So the grittiest people tend to be older people, controlling for everything else. Now, education is really interesting to me. And I think it says a lot about the link between grit and achievement and resilience. So, with one exception, the more education you have, the higher your grit score. Now, I'm not suggesting it's a causal relationship. In other words, it could be that you get farther in school because you have high grit, or it could be the other way around, okay? But here's the exception, and I have it here noted on the slide. Our community college students, community college graduates, their grit score is as high or higher than people who attain medical degrees or PhDs. Well, put in the chat box, see if you can figure out why. And we'll come back to that question in the discussion here in about three minutes when we open up the discussion about grit. See if you can figure out why you think community college graduates are so darned gritty. I mean that in a good way. And gender, no real difference between males and females. There's not a big strong gender effect. Men and women are pretty similar in this way. Okay, next. Just a couple more slides on grit, and we'll take a knee and take some questions. So to recapitulate, grit. So here's the link. Here's what I think is going on between grit and resilience. Most but not all of the grit research, the science that's being done on it, focuses on grit and then achieving things like graduating from college or getting through medical school or completing military training. But there's also research which shows that gritty people tend to be more resilient and better able to overcome adversities and not suffer psychologically maybe as much as less gritty people. Here's what I think at least part of the answer may be. Okay, because grit predicts accomplishment of these long-term difficult goals, okay, that we know that, this accomplishment, as you know, leads to a mastery and a sense of efficacy and self-control, and it builds self-esteem. So when you do well at hard things, doesn't it make you feel better about yourself? And then achievement, the things that come along with achievement, getting that college degree or whatever it may be, helps bring then meaning and purpose to life. So if you go back to that circle, that third slide we started with today, that goal of having meaning and purpose in life, I think what happens with grit is that being gritty allows you to develop expertise, to build self-confidence, ultimately to build self-esteem, and that gives meaning and purpose. When you get meaning and purpose, then when you hit road bumps along the way, you tend to be a bit more resilient. So we can talk about that here in a moment as well. Next, please. So just last thing I want to say about grit. You may be wondering, well, maybe my grit score was 2.9 or mine was high, but I'm kind of concerned about my teenage son or daughter's grit score, or my 10-year-old son or daughter's grit score. So the evidence here now that's emerging is that grit is something that can be nurtured and developed. Now, I hasten to say, not overnight. Okay, there's no instant pudding that you can eat that will will raise grit immediately. So Duckworth in her book talks about these 4 stages that people go through when they develop high grit. These are characteristics of people, children who later become older children, become teens, and then adults that become real gritty. But this could apply even to all of us, I think. So you think stage 1, you have to have something that you're interested in, something you have a sincere, genuine interest in. Now, if you're parents and you're thinking and you're watching your kids, it's good advice is to expose them to lots of different things and sort of take note as to what they sort of inherently, really find interesting and begin to nurture that. So once that sort of takes hold, once it's like you're fishing, once that hook sets, interest sort of sets the hook, the second stage is practice. Now, somebody saw in the chat last time, I believe, somebody said, well, it's more than just practice, right? It's what we call deliberate practice. It's more than just going through the motions. That's absolutely correct. So think about learning to be proficient at a musical instrument, whatever it may be. So a child or an adult can sit and kind of go through the motions and just do the basics and say, well, I practiced for an hour and a half today, I'm done, and then go do their thing. You're going to reach a plateau pretty quickly if you have that attitude. I'm a case in point. Even though I'm almost 2 meters tall, which means I'm 6'6", okay, and I was 6'6". I was 6 feet tall in the 6th grade, and my high school basketball coach found out about that, even though I was still in the 6th grade. And he thought I was going to be like 7 feet tall. So he was always bugging me to play. And I never even liked basketball that much, to tell you the truth. Got into high school, and he kind of conned me into being on the team. Then I ratted him out, or disappointed by only growing to 6'6" and not 7 foot. But when I practiced basketball, I didn't do it in a methodical, deliberate, difficult way. We would see who could shoot. We don't play horse or just play imaginary games where you hit a 3-pointer and win at the buzzer. And it wasn't the type of practice that made me better. So by practice, it's deliberate practice. It's hard. It's not always pleasant. It's very systematic and takes a long time. But as you go through that and you get better and better, stage 3 is where the activity comes to give you a sense of purpose. Now, you've heard me say that a lot the last 2 Fridays. Purpose and meaning and purpose. So the task becomes rewarding in and of itself. So really elite basketball players, and I've mentioned I work some consulting with the NBA. The great basketball players, they do other things in life, but boy, when it comes to basketball, they it just means so much to them. It defines their lives in so many ways. And then the stage 4 is a characteristic of highly gritty people, and it's called hope. There's an old Japanese saying called fall 7, rise 8. And so a gritty person, this maybe gets to the resilience piece. The person who's really gritty, when they do have a failure, they don't say, well, I've fallen down, why bother to get up? They keep rising. If they fall again, they rise again. If they fall again, they rise again. And through doing that, that sort of defines grit, but I think that also defines resilience. Okay, next. And we'll stop now. Let's see what questions we might have on grit. And then we'll talk about
Mike, when you asked that folks take the grit test and a number of results came in, there were immediately some questions for a lot of us on how do we improve our grit scores, and is there a way to change some of these? Because I think some of the folks on the line were surprised that their scores were maybe lower than they expected. So wondering if you have any initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So it is disappointing if you think you're kind of a gritty person. And look, it's a 10-question test. It's not perfect, right? So don't beat yourself up too much. But one thing you might do is go back and I think the test is fairly apparent if you retake it, but do it slower and look at the ones that you didn't score yourself so high on, and then reflect on that question. Let's say maybe you're a 3 instead of a 5 on that one. And are there things you can do in your life that get back to interest, practice, meaning, and hope that you could start systematically doing to build that? So I'm thinking, you know, how do you build a child's grit to do, you know, grit score to do better in school, you know, for instance, or athletics, I guess. You know, got to establish that interest, and then practices of behavior. Once you identify something you want to excel at, then if you have a more systematic set of goals and sub-goals, and Angela talks about this in her book, this hierarchy of goals, that really enhances that second stage of practice. And then if you do that, that tends to produce higher meaning. And I think if you sort of did that holistically, just with your overall concept of grit, that would help, but also unpack each of those questions. And, you know, with only 10 questions, it may only be 2 or 3 questions you marked lower that brought your score down a little bit. And I mean, you could just go back and change your score if that wouldn't mean anything. Really go back and reflect on the ones that you can see just readily by looking at it that were not as gritty, and see if there are behaviors that you can engage in that would tend to help you, you know, get better at that.
One of the other questions, and a number of comments came in on this when you asked about community colleges and how is it that some of those folks have higher grit? And so some people chimed in and said, well, they're older, and so if we know that grit increases with age, that may be part of it. A number of other folks chimed in to talk about the types of folks taking community college and how many may be working while putting themselves through school. And I love this one question one of the participants asked about, you know, how does your upbringing influence grit? And so this idea of, you know, how does that influence how you would do it in an academy setting, or does growing up on a farm mean you'll be more gritty? So just wanted to send that your way and get any thoughts on upbringing and grit and how that really impacts.
I mean, I think upbringing is critical, and you know, the experiences you have in your formative young years are hyper important. But I also think that we lose sight too of how important peer groups are, especially when kids get old enough to go to school, you know, and what are their peers, you know, and what's the climate of their grade school like? What are the expectations there? And other social groups that kids find themselves in. You know, a mistake that some parents make, you can decide if you think it's a mistake or not, is they decide, well, I want my kid to be like really, really good at the violin. So they buy them a violin when they're 3 years old, and they just make them sit there and torture them with it, you know, however many hours a day, and they progress to a point. But what happens if the child didn't develop that first stage, or truly had a genuine interest in the violin? What's the impact of that? You know, they're going to reject it, and maybe even develop emotional, you know, sort of emotional responses to the parent for being forced to do something they absolutely hated, you know, to no end. So I think with regard to the children's environment, you know, being attentive to the range of things they really like. I mean, there's probably some room for direction, you know, as a parent, but it's probably an art, and good parents master it, to know when to push and when not to push. Let me go back to, I saw a question I wanted to say. Yeah, okay, somebody wanted to speculated about grit, and I want to come back to this about academic achievement, the community college people. So those data were controlling for age. So when you control for age, the community college students are still higher. So I think those of you who speculated that it was about what type of person is willing to work a 40-hour week job, raise 2 or 3 kids, and go to school at the same time. That's somebody who has a passionate pursuit of a long-term goal, you know? So I have taught at a number of universities through the years, not just West Point and the Air Force Academy, but and also a private university that had a very extensive continuing education program. And I love teaching in the evening program who are adult learners. And the adult learners could be, you know, 18 or 19, or they could be 45 or 50. But they were there. They made a conscious decision. They were there because they wanted to be there, and they had this really strong desire to improve themselves and get a college degree. And I think that's it. That sampling the community college is somebody who's just, they're usually paying for it themselves, work crazy hours, you know, I said, raising kids often. A lot of single moms and dads doing that at the same time. I think that's it. What else, Jess? Did I miss? I think I missed one or two things. What else did you like to talk about?
The only other question, well, there's a handful, but the other one that came up that I think is asked in a number of circles is about generational differences in grit. And so, you know, is there something about the nature of different generations that may shed light on whether or not there are some differences across generations?
I'm smiling in response to that question, because some years ago, you know, when Jess and I were working for Chief of Staff of the Army, we go on tour and talk to large groups of senior officers. And I would talk about these things, and the generals generally had kids who were like in high school or maybe early college. They were convinced that generation of kids, Gen X, were just not as gritty as they were, and they were probably not as gritty as the World War II people. And I don't really think if you scrape down and look carefully that there's that much of a generational difference. Grit may manifest itself a little bit differently by generations, you know, so you think about the current generation of kids, you know, with all the electronics and media and stuff that they have, the tools they have that we didn't have, you know, so they put their time at different things. But I still suspect that if you could control for the cohort, the year a kid was born, and we can now, probably get enough data, that you really wouldn't see too much difference based on generation. It may just look a little differently because the world changes, but I think that the nervous system of the human being hasn't changed that much.
I think that's spot on, Mike. I know that the generational focus has come up quite a bit over the last decade, and you know, some research suggests that there aren't those significant differences, but continue to get questions on that.
I'd like to answer Mary's questions. She had two quick ones about, is grit skill predominantly mental strength versus physical strength? I think it's a, I'm sorry to use such a professorial word. It's sort of more of a cognitive idea. It's a cognitive factor, but a belief system, which then if you employ it, could make you better at grades. But I think it's fundamentally a mental strength. Now, if you're really good at that mental strength and you just flat don't give up no matter what, then you're gonna be better at whatever interests you and that you practice a lot at, whether it's a physical task or a mental task. And then Mary also asked, is it due to income or poverty? And there, you know, poverty and our economic circumstances play a tremendous role in a lot of ways in what we can become, mostly for worse, maybe sometimes for better. It may be that to some extent that children who have parents who have to work very, very, very hard, show grit themselves and model that behavior in order to be successful, may have some advantage because they've seen that behavior modeled versus someone who's, what's the phrase, born with a silver spoon in their mouth. So I've got a neighbor who said, we were talking one day, and he's got a little daughter, and he said, my goal is to make enough money in life that she never has to have a job. You know, I didn't say anything, but I thought, my gosh, you know, you think about the importance of work to psychological well-being and meaning and importance. I was sort of shocked by that. So I think we better move on. And sorry, I know there's some other questions, but I think it's time to move on to hardiness so we can get through some other important things today. I'm gonna spend a little less time on hardiness, but it's not that it's less important. This is a bristlecone pine. Those of you who have been stationed out west, Fort Carson, or any of the forts and other bases out west, and gone hiking up in the Rockies have maybe seen these things. Some of these are up to 5,000 years old, which is pretty humbling. And they tend to grow in these very arid, rocky, sort of high elevation environments. And you know, if something survives 5,000 years, or heck, maybe it's a young one, maybe it's only 2,000 years old, it's survived lightning and windstorms and avalanches and storms. The word is it's hardy. It's a hardy plant, right? I happen to have like the world's hardiest weed out by my house this year. I think I knocked it down 3 or 4 times. I tried to starve it. I tried to kill it. It just keeps growing no matter what. It's so hardy. It just keeps going. So psychological hardiness then is the ability to face, challenge, and overcome it. So let's go to the next slide. Now, there's actually a longer history of research on hardiness. This goes back nearly 40 years now than there is with grit, which goes back about 15 years. Now, the message I'll have, this will be much shorter, this discussion, but hardiness has 3 components to it. So there's overall hardiness for a human being, but the components are called collectively the 3 C's, as you can see. And the three C's are commitment. So commitment is kind of like grit, and it means that once you commit to something, you see it through. You know, now we could talk about, is there a time even gritty people should break off? And of course, yes, there is, right? Hardy people. But generally speaking, once you make a commitment to something, you're willing to see it through kind of no matter what. The second C is challenge. So people who are high in hardiness, I've looked at it some, and then others of my colleagues have also looked at hardiness in military populations that apply here. Challenge is when you encounter an obstacle and you look at the obstacle as a chance to learn and get better and to develop or deploy new skills to overcome that challenge. You could contrast that with threat. So some people encounter that same obstacle and it's a threat and they sort of like fall apart. So a person high in challenge is one who faces an obstacle head on, actively comes up with strategies to overcome it and moves on. And the third C is control. This is a very psychological thing. It's been studied a lot. People who genuinely believe that what happens to them in life is to no small degree, or to a large degree, is under their own control, versus those who believe that fate controls everything. Those who are high in that sense of control, in general, fare better in terms of resilience and invulnerability to hard times than those who tend to feel that they don't have control, or that fate prevails. So again, a highest sense of commitment, that obstacles are a challenge, not a threat, and a high sense of control together make up this sense called hardiness. Next, please. So here's some findings. We find that hardy cadets excel at West Point and other service academies and other universities and other settings. The most interesting study I've actually personally conducted, so we measured hardiness among cadets, once again, the day after they arrived at West Point, before they were really cadets. And we sampled 1,200, we got 1,200 out of that group. That's an entire class of whatever it was. I think it was a class of 2009. In any case, we then kind of just ignored them and forgot about them for 7 years until they graduated and spent 3 years actually in the Army. So now they're 3 years out in the Army, which they're first lieutenants. And oh, by the way, they weren't just 3 years in the Army. Most of them had combat deployments by this point, had been platoon leaders in combat. Then we recontacted all of their battalion commanders and had them rate these now officers on a number of dimensions relating to leadership. And what we found was very clearly that hardiness, measured the day they arrived at West Point, predicted who would be rated by their lieutenant colonel battalion commanders as the best leaders 7 years later. Now, battalion commanders had no idea what these lieutenants' crit scores were. So it was really, I think, a very powerful and important finding, because it demonstrates in a very challenging environment, combat, that this concept of hardiness makes a difference. And then another researcher, Paul Bartone, has looked at a whole bunch of stuff with military personnel with combat deployments over the last few years. And generally speaking, it always turns out that people who are high in these hardiness measures have less pathology, less prone to PTSD, and more prone to re-enlist and do positive things. Next. So here's a couple of points. I think this is about all I have on hardiness. It's a learnable skill, okay, to a large extent. You're not stuck with your hardiness as it is now. Unfortunately, I don't have a really easy test for it that I can give you to take here handily. This one, the next comment, I'm speaking to the people who are managers and leaders here that are listening today. I've given the same advice to the Special Forces, and they've done this. So there's a place called the Hardiness Institute, and you can Google it, and that's the web address you'll find. The Hardiness Institute is run by a scientist, Dr. Salvador Matti, who invented the idea of hardiness. And he's come up with a train the trainer approach. So you send 2 or 3 year people out, or maybe now you do it by Zoom. It could easily be done that way. And they take a week's worth of classes on how to train others to be hardy. And so the data have shown that this train the trainer approach is a really effective way to improve resilience for people. So like I said, I've counseled Special Forces to do this, and I think they've done it. Anytime I get a chance to talk to managers and leaders, to really recommend this. I have no vested interest in this monetarily or otherwise. I just think it's just really good stuff. So if you want to learn more about that, managers and leaders, go and look at that website and see if that appeals to you. In terms of a suggested reading, Paul Bartone, B-A-R-T-O-N-E, and his colleague, I forget his first name, Stein, they just published a book this spring. You can see the title. If you put in Stein and Bartone into Amazon, that book will pop up. And it has everything you want to know about hardiness and then some. So I think that's it with hardiness. Let me go to the next slide and confirm that. And let's just pause for a second before we talk about sleep. Did anybody have any questions about hardiness? And Jess, you can see that.
Mike, we had a question. Someone talked about their grit score and being hard-headed. You know, people describing them as hard-headed and stubborn. And are those things related?
I don't think necessarily. I mean, you know, I think some of the most gritty people I know, they're persistent, and in fact, they're doggedly persistent. But that doesn't mean that they're not open to other ideas and listening to other advice. In fact, one way you achieve hard goals is you're open-minded and listen to strategies and advice that others can have to offer to you, I think. So no, I don't really think they necessarily go together. There certainly are people who are hard-headed and probably are gritty, probably not especially pleasant always, all the time pleasant to be around. All the results are good. Hope that answers the question.
What about the impact of some of these challenges we're seeing? Somebody's calling in from an area in California where there's a lot of wildfires. We've got folks dealing with COVID. How does that impact our grit and hardiness?
Well, that's a good question. So the research and experience of the sort of applied experience with grit and hardiness are those who are who have that attribute going into that event come out the other side better. But what you're saying here is something a little bit different, is what's the impact of an adverse event on subsequent adjustment? And there's a concept called post-traumatic growth, which for some people, after they go through some ordeal like that, end up stronger, at least in some ways, psychologically and emotionally than they were before they went in. Now, I kind of suspect that people who tend to grow from that might be those who are a little hardier to start with. Because if you're not especially hardy, just talk about that one, and then you encounter something like the wildfires on top of the pandemic, on top of everything else. Remember that graph of the 4 trajectories? If you plummet down to that x-axis, you know, it's hard to show growth if you're clinically depressed or, you know, have full-blown PTSD. So I think a lot of it depends on sort of the skills you have going in, the mindset you have going in will influence greatly how you come out. And I can really relate to the wildfires. My wife, Gretchen, she's from Chico, California, which is just down the road in Paradise. And last summer, fires swept through Paradise and killed, 80 people. So she knew people who lost their property at least, and lost their homes and wiped it out. So it is, and yet, understand if you go to Paradise now, I mean, Paradise, California, be nice to go to Paradise. And go to Paradise, California. Already, these gritty, hardy people are rebuilding and, you know, trying to reestablish their lives. So I think we best go on. So I want to talk just briefly about the performance triad, and the Army has come up with this concept. It's nothing earth-shaking. I think all of us could agree that things like sleep and nutrition and exercise are important. I just want to dig probably mostly into sleep, because that's the one we think we self-inflict on ourselves the worst. You know, military culture seems particularly so true in the Army. I have not served in the Navy or been around Navy folks quite as much. It's true somewhat in the Air Force as well. Not somewhat, a lot. Like the best, the toughest leader is the one who can go the most without sleep. You know, sort of this sense of the tougher you are, the less you have to sleep. And we start that with the cadets. You know, we start that early on, give them too much to do. And the average cadet sleeps just under 5 hours a night, Monday through Thursday. They get to sleep a little bit more sometimes on the weekend. And we do that. We continue those behaviors once we graduate and get these now lieutenants and later someday colonels, some days generals out in the force. They still are not sleeping enough. And here's some of the things that happen when you don't sleep enough. And yeah, I won't comment on all of these. You just read through them. I will comment on the fourth and the fifth bullet. So decision-making under uncertainty, especially under uncertainty. You know, you can probably decide what color socks to put on in the morning if you're sleepy. If you're trying to make life and death decisions, or things of equal importance in a corporate environment, maybe it's not life or death, but really important questions, sleep loss is really affects that. And we see that all the time. There's a great example historically was General Custer, or at that time, Lieutenant Colonel Custer, who led the soldiers to the Little Bighorn. And the evidence shows he was about 36 hours sleep deprived at the time of the Little Bighorn, and he was not hearing the advice he was getting from his subordinates or not making sense of it, and made decisions that arguably, had he been better rested, he wouldn't have made. So that's just speculation, but it could be true. We see evidence of it from experience as well. And the fifth one, moral judgment is altered by sleep deprivation. We talked in a previous session about why do good people make bad decisions and show bad character. Some of that could be sleep deprivation or restriction. Okay? Sleep deprivation means you don't sleep for, say, 36 or 48 hours at a time. Sleep restriction are more like the cadets. You're sleeping every night, but not very much. Okay? And of course, there's plenty of health consequences that go along with that as well. So anyway, so the point being simply that sleep restriction, you know, we all have to live our lives. Again, so I recognize if you're going, you know, you're working 40 hours or more a week, and you've got children, and you know, you've got hobbies, and you've got a social life, and on and on. Sometimes it's hard to find enough time to sleep. But I'd argue that making sleep a priority and seeing it as something that's important to keep yourself functioning at your optimal level is worth thinking about. Next. This is like a really busy slide. This is just so interesting to me. So what this slide is going to tell you, it's just going to tell you that when you can equate hours of sleep deprivation with blood alcohol content, like you're drinking alcohol, so that X number of hours of sleep deprivation equals DWI in most states. So hit the button again, and just keep hitting it until we get to the end of this slide. So 24 hours, not much of an effect. So you see at the top, you're doing okay. Some afternoon, we all have a little afternoon dip, maybe because you've had, you're eating lunch and you're digesting your food. Now we start sleep deprivation. And look what happens to performance. And after about 24 hours, you get this really huge drop. And you get to the point after 24 hours that your blood alcohol equivalent, these are people not having any alcohol, but the equivalent is 0.08, which is DWI in every state. Now, I told you I was at law enforcement once, and like the worst accident, well, one of the worst accidents I ever responded to was a car crossed an interstate at full speed one evening about 7 o'clock. It was dark because it was wintertime. Crossed the interstate and hit a semi head on at high speed, and of course killed both occupants instantly. And so the investigators found out they'd been driving from Arizona to to Chicago nonstop, and they had been about 24 or more hours without sleep by the time they had that accident. The woman driver fell asleep at the wheel. And I think if you do a little Google search in this, you'll see that sleep deprivation and its effects on traffic fatalities rank right up there with blood alcohol. So imagine if you can't drive a car right because you're too sleepy, what other kind of decisions you'll suffer at as well, not to mention as well emotionally. Next, please. Yeah, right, about truck drivers. They're supposed to have that time, but Illinois. So the RX for sleep, we all differ. So look, I need about 7 to 7.5 hours sleep. If I get that, I do okay. That's, for a person my age. There are people who can get by just fine or 5 or 6 hours of sleep per night. There are people that need 8 or 9 or 10 hours. If you've got teenagers, they probably need 10 or 11 hours. As you get older, you need less sleep. Know what your needs are. I always wear a Fitbit. I don't have a smartwatch yet, but they'll do the same thing like an Apple Watch. They'll monitor your activity and give you at least some feedback on your sleep. You may be surprised to see how little sleep you're getting if you look at your screen each day when you look at your that and see how much sleep you're really getting from your Fitbit. Use this feedback to monitor your own cognitive and emotional effectiveness and see if you start drawing some parallels. Well, if it's now Thursday, it's now Friday, and you've slept 5 hours a night this week, and now you're falling asleep or trying to I don't blame you, multitask while you're listening to me drone on, if you're not at peak effectiveness, that may be why. There are technologies you can use that help you sleep. Like I use what's called a white noise generator. Go Google that if you've never heard of it. It's a little device you can buy. It don't cost much. And it generates a sound kind of like a fan blowing, and it drowns out competing sounds. And I find it really helpful when I'm falling asleep and trying to sustain sleep, not to hear a car drive by or maybe the dog, bark next door or something like that. Watch what you eat and drink. Caffeine, so we fall in this habit of drinking caffeine in the morning and alcohol at night, some people, and that just aggravates the sleep and makes it worse. And then consistency is important. Now, I know we all live in a real world, Hey, I've got the ocean one too. That sounds really good, Ashley. Sorry, somebody can't respond to some of these comments as I see them. So next. This will be much quicker. Performance triad would combine nutrition and exercise. The buffet equals the cat. Okay, so we all love buffets, at least I know I do. And but here's where self-regulation comes into play. Next. So I give this a executive resilience seminar to the new brigadier generals for the Air Force, most summers. Haven't this year or last because of issues with this year pandemic. This slide I kind of borrowed from that. Coffee is not food. Okay, so in the military environment, it seems like people think it is sometimes. Second bullet, nutrition bars gobbled up while you're working do not provide the nutrients needed. You can read it's not really a good source for food or making your brain function properly. You look left and look right, or look at the mirror. Some of us, this might fit. Okay, so try to learn to eat a little better balanced. It's common sense in some respects. So you can use caffeine tactically, but there is a thing called caffeineism. It actually is an addiction. You can become addicted to caffeine. Some of you probably nodding your head, yeah, nodding your head, say, yeah, I know. And withdrawal can be pretty unpleasant. So it's something you want to try to avoid. You do that by really being very judicious in your use of it. Eat balanced meals. Power bars aren't going to get you there. Eat like a king in the morning, a prince at noon, and a pauper in the evening is an old saying. So load up in the morning, have a pretty good lunch, and then eat less in the evening. You'll sleep better, and your brain will work better. As assuming that's not assuming that you work days and sleep nights. Some of you may be the opposite. Maintain a balance between aerobics and weight-bearing exercise, and if you can, get a trainer. It's helpful. Yeah, crew rest is real. And then frequent short exercises in lieu of going to the gym these days. The gyms around here are just now starting to open again. been 5 months without gyms, really help cognitive function and helps emotional function. So personally, I have my little Fitbit set, so it reminds me at 10 minutes until the hour, if I haven't walked 250 steps, to get up and walk 250 steps. It takes me about 2 or 3 minutes to do that. Getting up and just walking down the hall and back, making a lap, throughout the day is just really important to your overall well-being. And then when you can, a more systematic and strenuous type of exercise as well. These are real common sense things, I know that, but common sense doesn't mean they're easy to operationalize and do. So really pay attention to nutrition and exercise in terms of being a resilient person. You can't be resilient if you're hungry and tired out. Next. I don't have so much here to say that all this, as important as this is, social and family bonds are hypercritical. We could almost just leave it with this picture and let's go to the next slide anyway. We're getting close here and we'll open to general discussion. The caveat here is the social groups you align yourself with, your social environment, can be very, very, very good for you, or it can be very, very, very bad for you. And I focused on the very, very, very good. So the very good piece is when you establish and nurture positive social connections at work and at home and among your friends. Social connections where you bring each other up rather than bring each other down. You have high cohesion, or in the military we say esprit de corps. I imagine most of you are old enough, you worked in different units and in different organizations, and sometimes you've experienced great esprit de corps and other times not so great. Isn't it a real difference maker in how you feel and your attitude and your ability to take on hard things? So a highly cohesive, high esprit de corps unit can endure a lot more than a unit that's not pulling together. So, if you're a follower, like if you're a leader, the time that you spend as a leader building esprit de corps and cohesion versus training specific tasks is time well spent. If you're a follower, I'm sort of a professor type, and so I don't always go in for all the social stuff in my units as much. Maybe some people do, but I make myself do it because I know it's important. And as usual, I'm happy I did. Use your positive character skills to address conflicts. And like we talked about in this lesson last week, or in the discussion last week, identify those positive character skills, know what they are, use them as a tool to work through conflict and problems with coworkers and friends. And then time invested with family and friends plays a different. Now I said it could be a very bad thing as well, right? So one example used in this book I have coming out in October about a negative side is we had a team at West Point. I may mention this briefly in a previous session. It was a men's rugby team, and on the face of it, they were pretty good young men, I suppose. But they'd established a culture where they ridiculed women sexually, and they had a sort of shared website that they used, or a social media platform that they shared. They take pictures of women in the stands and rate them on a scale of 1 to 10, and I won't even say all the terrible other things that they would say, and they thought they were being cool, and they thought they were really, smarter than everybody else, I guess, so imagine a new player coming into that team. Now that team becomes their sort of social checklist, their comparison point. Well, you're the plebe or the new cadet, and you're in that team. All these firsties and cows, these more senior people, man, they're like this. Maybe I will be too. I think I don't have to say any more. You can see how there is an instance where what could be a very positive social support network became a very negative one. And so we have to be, as leaders, aware of that can happen and to intervene appropriately when need be. Okay, next. Okay, next. Just one slide. This is way too much. Don't leave the room. Okay, just look at the bottom of this. So there's a whole bunch of stuff about here that you can look at later, the slides if you want to. But the leadership behaviors that maximize subordinates resilience at the bottom, that's the important part. So a PTE is a potentially traumatic event. So if you're training, I think for the SARCs, this doesn't maybe apply quite so much because you're always going to be in the second box, right? Responding to PTEs. You're always in that box. So if you're a leader of SARCs and your people are always responding to these potentially traumatic events, or at least adverse events, you probably want to balance out your task orientation with your relational orientation about 70-30, according to the research we're finding. Now, let's say that some really heinous event has occurred under your purview, and there's been a rash of rapes or sexual assaults, and then you're kind of in this third phase after the PTEs, kind of taking it. Then you pivot. You spend a lot less time on the task, being task oriented. You do AARs and learn from mistakes. Now's the time, really, as a leader, to put your time into relational oriented leadership. Get to know your subordinates, their needs, what's bugging them. Spend time to tell them that they've done a good job. Develop your own self-awareness and model coping flexibility. I just challenge the leaders here when you think about if you sort of divide your day into two things: task orientation and relation orientation. When hard times hit, spending more time in relational orientation can help your coworkers and subordinates a great deal. And we definitely send slides out. Okay, next. Okay, just one or two more slides and we'll open to general discussions. So just a couple of additional recommendations, just general things that I can add. Next. So first of all the organizations I've ever worked for, the military does probably the best job of providing health and wellness programs. Whether it's a base or a post, we've got gyms and we've got wellness programs and you've got all kinds of things of that nature. You've got psychological services, you've got, treatment or assistance for people with substance abuse disorders and whatnot. As a leader, make sure you know what all of those are. And as a worker, as a, person who's just part of the day-to-day work there, use those resources, be aware of them. Second recommendation goes back to the hardiness. You can build trust. I'm sorry, yeah, it involves hard, but business service has to do with trust. You build trust as a leader and as a worker by building those 3 C's. Work on your comps, get better at your job. So the lieutenant, we graduate a lieutenant from West Point and they go to the infantry officer basic school. They learn how to take apart a machine gun and put it together and fire it and all that stuff. We don't expect them to ever necessarily use a machine gun in combat. But when they're training their soldiers, they need to have competence at that, to demonstrate that competence of soldier skills, to build trust of that subordinate. Well, maybe you're not around machine guns very much as SARCs, but you have other skills that you can build and to demonstrate that competence, do that. Always work on your character. The second session we had last week about nurturing character, of learning about it, identifying what your strengths are, that addresses that. And always take time to care for others. So we're kind of closing out here. Health and wellness, build the trust by the 3 C's. To be forewarned is to be forearmed. They make yourself try to anticipate possible stressors. Be aware of threats, but also look at them as opportunities. And then down at the bottom, I put in a plug for mindfulness training last week and just doing that again. Okay, next. Wrapping up, biggest obstacles to resilience, here they are. Dysfunctional work-life balance. Okay. Just pause, you can probably just search your memory banks, look left and right or up and down. You can probably imagine yourself or others who have that imbalance, and maybe some who do have the balance. You get tired, it's hard to have self-awareness. If you're hungry, tired, not well-nourished, or simply just so task-oriented you're not paying attention to yourself. Spend time on reflection, it's important. poor sleep and nutrition habits mentioned, failure to maintain strong social support networks. And then somebody asked this last time, made the point, especially in the military context, that reluctance to seek help because you don't want to be perceived as weak. You know, hey, you break a leg, you're going to get the broken bone fixed. If you're a little depressed, why not get that fixed? Why not? Most important thing to do, then we'll go to questions, is the best thing to optimize your performance adjustment. Attack these things head on. Remember, you can't be the ostrich. You can't stick your head in the sand and hope that problems go away. They only get better when you're gritty and hardy and attack things straight on. Okay, next. All right, general discussion. Hope you can see that cartoon. I think it says, what does it say? All the resilience has gone out of this guy. So sometimes maybe that's how you feel after this long session. If so, sorry. So Jess, your question?
Hopefully that is not how people feel. I know I certainly don't feel that way.
I got to say, Jess and I were talking about this. I said, I feel like I've inflicted like one too many sessions on you. You could get resilience fatigue. I hope that's not the case. Bear with us. We'll try to do that. Okay.
So we've got a number of great questions, Mike, and one of them is around the relationship between personal values and how they impact individual resilience, whether it's grit or hardiness.
Well, I think that's the theme, you know. So you can think about values of being sort of like two types. There's sort of moral values, like doing right or wrong, you know, and there's performance values like grit. And you know, to the extent that you have, you know, probably, no, honestly, we probably all have some sort of smorgasbord of some pretty good values and character strengths and some which maybe aren't so strong. And my theme here is that the trick is finding out what you're good at, what character strengths and moral values and virtues you have, and learn to use those. So, you know, next week I'm going to talk about some tips for like if you're not especially strong in strengths of humanity. I'm going to give some examples and some steps you can take to build that. But really, I think more than anything else, it's learning what your sort of hierarchy of strengths are and learning to deploy them to the task at hand, whether that task is getting a job done or being a loving family member.
That's great. Thank you, Mike. One of the other questions is around the example you gave with the child growing up and playing the violin and tying that concept to soldiers. So how do we instill grit in soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen in preparation for combat or deployment?
So I still believe, even though I don't have any strong empirical evidence to support this, I still believe that thousands of years of military practice of basic training has developed a grit building exercise. Basic training done right should build grit. Now, I say I don't have empirical evidence for it because I've measured cadets' grit before and after basic training, didn't see much change, but that's because they're so darned high to start with, okay? Anecdotally, when I look back to high school and I think about all these like high school friends, this is still during Vietnam, and some who were the biggest, like honestly, some of the biggest losers in my high school class. Of those who went, and I remember one in particular, he was overweight, he was a real slug, he wasn't a great student, he didn't have many social skills. And so which branch do you think he joined? Marine Corps. And he comes back out of Marine Corps and he was a transformed individual. You know, I think it really changed his life and it made him more gritty. Now, and so I think military training done right, which means, and I mean, guys, there's people in this audience who know a lot more about this than I do, but which is filled with challenges that can be overcome, and try to minimize the trivial crap that goes on in training, but really get at important stuff. Those are real grit builders. So I'd like to think more about that and give a better answer. I think we in the military, associated with military, have a unique platform on which to help young people in particular develop grit and hardiness.
One of the other questions we're getting, I think, is really related to the first responders that are on the line, and that's about what what happens when you're good at what is in many cases bad for you? So when I think back to that word cloud and, these ideas around empathy and kindness and compassion and knowing how exhausting it can be when you're high in those areas, but that's a critical part of your job. How does that impact grit or hardiness, or are there ways to mitigate some of the negative aspects of your job that are also critical to high performance?
Well, first of all, hats off to everybody who works in the first responder world, and I consider the SARCs first responders as well. You guys are dealing sort of the pointy edge of the spear, pointed parts, tip of the spear when you're in preventing and dealing with these instances. I think that the challenge is, Jess, is that these jobs are really complex. So if police work, for example, only involved, arresting bad people, violators, then you could probably compartmentalize that and deal with it okay. But so much of first responding works does require empathy and strengths of humanity, and you see death and suffering, and it does. And I mentioned this before. It's something you can't just turn off necessarily when you go off shift. So part of the answer to that comes back to this theme I have of looking at your constellation of character strengths, and among those strengths is perspective. So how do you take those experiences that you find particularly challenging and disturbing and put them into some sense of perspective? Now, I mean, I've been to situations where that's very difficult. The death of a child, the murder of a child, the rape of a child, or something like that comes to mind. And, there are things that I think that everybody in the first responder community will say that haunt them their entire lives. But even having said that, if you what is the meaning and purpose? Part of the reason you're in that job is to make a paycheck. Everybody needs a paycheck, but you can make better money oftentimes in other. Okay, why do you stay? You probably stay because you also got a chance to make a positive difference in people's lives. One time I got to grab a woman jumping off a bridge and caught her airborne and yanked her back. She would have fallen in front of us, some semis, and shoot her up, if that had happened. I felt pretty good that night, And so I think, these character strengths of things like perspective and wisdom and trying to take, when you take a particularly challenging event like that and place it into a larger context of what you do, employing your strengths to build that context is vitally important. That's my dog. My dogs are saying hi, by the way. Hope you heard them. Okay.
I know we've only got a handful more minutes, Mike, but we've got some questions on sleep that I think are important.
Yes.
What is, we've got one question just about this idea around making up sleep. And I know that the research has shifted over the years there. And then the other question is about, in general, the importance of sleep for first responders. And kind of knowing, the cycle that first responders work in.
So here's the first question, like sleep debt. So if you go, like the typical cadet sleeps 4 or 5 hours a night for first 4 nights of the week or 5 nights of the week, and then what they do in the weekend, they try to make up for it, right? Although some of them just go out pre-COVID and party, do things all college students do. And the evidence suggests that you can make up, to a small extent, you can make up for it. But generally speaking, sleep is something that you just consider every 24-hour period, you need your 7 or 8. Now you can suck it up and go a couple or 3 days sleeping very little and kind of get, wade your way through that, gut your way through that. But that can't be a consistent lifestyle, And if you try to do that more than 2 or 3 days, then you start getting those negative impacts that I detailed in that one slide. And then, so the message there is that it's really ultimately difficult to make up for lost sleep. And one danger you might have, like when I was in officer training school, my basic training, we slept so little and worked so hard. If we even was the Air Force, we worked pretty hard. And finally get off like on a Saturday afternoon if I had time, I might sleep like till 2 in the morning on Sunday morning, get up and have a bite to eat, sleep until noon the next day if I could. And then what happens Sunday night? Couldn't sleep, right? So consistency is really important. And just what was the second part of that question?
It was about the importance of sleep to first
no, I remember.
responders, like knowing that it's imperative, but that the jobs aren't always set up in a way that's
Yeah.
optimal.
So your challenge is shift work very frequently. And so there's a biology to that. So even if you're on shift work, most people at 3 o'clock in the morning, your body temperature is lowest, even if you're working the midnight shift, and body temperature correlates with your mental alertness and your emotional awareness and so forth. So, the challenge becomes as a leader is how do you schedule shifts in a way to minimize the disruption? There's going to be disruption. How do you minimize it? So this has been studied and overstudied by all the services, and there's some amazingly bad strategies that the military's employed through the years. Now, you guys are Navies. Somebody might know if they still try to do this. I looked at this question 30 years ago when I was doing some work for NASA, developing some of the habitability issues at the space station. We had similar questions like how much should astronauts sleep and when. The Navy at the time was at least experimenting within submarine crews having awake 4 hours, asleep 4 hours, awake 4 hours, sleep 4 hours for like 3 months. Didn't work so great. So you have to consider mission requirements and with the human element, the human part of the system, and come up with in police work, it's better to rotate shifts once a month or once every 3 months than it is to rotate weekly. It's that rotation of the shift. When you go from days to midnights or vice versa, that's more disruptive. You can kind of sort of adapt if you're on it long enough. So now it's a real challenge. And if you're working the midnight shift, buy that sleep sleep generator, noise generator. Make sure your sleeping room is dark if you're starting to sleep during the days. There's things you can do to try to optimize that. It'll probably never be perfect. It's a real challenge for first responders. Anybody does shift work.
One of the other questions about sleep is why adults need less sleep as they get older. Is it that they need less sleep, or is it just that they get less sleep?
Yes, your brain changes. So when you're 20, you sleep about 8 or 9 hours a night, and the first half of the night is really, really, really deep sleep, and the second half of the night is more dreaming. And when you're my age, when you're over 40, well over 40, but when you get older, first of all, you go from 8 hours sleep down to 6 or 7. And secondly, you don't go into the stage 3 and 4, which is the deepest stages of sleep, nearly as much. So I'm lucky if I get 30 minutes of deep sleep a night. It's your brain change. It's a neurochemical change in how your brain is. I think it's pretty universal. So my anecdote, my treatment for that antidote is to, when I can, so I try to do a strategic nap, it's 15 or 20 minutes in the middle of the afternoon. It helps me make up for that shorter, less satisfying sleep that you have as an older adult. God, I wish I could sleep like I did when I was 15. That was so nice.
So I know we've only got a few minutes left, Mike. Are there any, and we will be sharing the resource document you sent out. We will post that on our site. Are there any other resources you want to share in terms of sites or books that people can go to learn more about sleep health?
I do have a chapter that I think is fairly readable that I could send to you, Jess, that you could share.
Okay, great.
I've edited a book called Human Performance Optimization, and I had one of the Navy's top sleep expert, Dr. Nita Miller of the Naval Postgraduate School, wrote that chapter. It's full of military stuff. So ping me for that, Jess, and I'll send it to you, and you get that out to everybody. And it's pretty readable.
Wonderful. Well, we're just at 11:30, at least Pacific time over here. And I know we've got folks from all over the world. I appreciate everybody joining. Mike, is there any last?
Yes. Marno just made a comment about sleep and suicide, sleep disruption. This is really important. And just extend that to depression. So VA psychologists and others and psychiatrists are finding that restricted sleep and sleep disturbances are a causal factor in depression and suicide, and not the other way around. And they're actually using sleep therapy, finding sleep therapy more effective in treating depression than some of the pharmacologically based treatments they compare them to. So that that comment was spot on. We can pull on that chain a little bit more
Oh,
next week if you guys want to.
that would be wonderful. Thanks, Marlo, for bringing that up. Anything else you want to share, Mike, in terms of closing comments or thoughts?
I have all sorts of ridiculous, witty, crazy things to say, which are irrelevant. Because it's Friday and I'm thinking like it's Miller time, but now I've reached that point. I've reached that point in my life where one beer makes me feel like I've had 10 and it bloats me up. It's not any fun. So you got younger people out there, if you feel like Miller time, you're not driving, go have your Miller beer or whatever and enjoy it. But I guess I'm just going to go for a walk or something. So be it. I look forward to those of you who can join me next Friday. We'll wrap it up. And I think you should give them extra credit, Jess, for anybody that endures all 4 sessions.
Absolutely. We are definitely going to track that. So
Okay.
Thanks so much, Dr. Matthews. We appreciate it. And thanks to everyone on the line. We will see you here, same time, same place next Friday. Have a good one.
Okay, Jess, as usual, I'll come back on in a few minutes.
Okay, sounds great.
Bye, guys. Bye, everybody.
Bye.